even though by definition cannabis reform is criminal justice reform. Fundamentally, it's about repealing criminal prohibitions. If you look back at even California's medical marijuana reform back in 1996, what that fundamentally was, what a lot of states have done in this space as their first step, is just to provide a defense to criminal liability, right? It is a criminal reform, first and foremost. And yet, then as we move to the next stage, as we move to, okay, what does real criminal justice reform look like in this space, that issue gets left behind pretty darn quickly as we move towards not inappropriate concerns about public health, regulatory reform, all the things that become understandably a part of a conversation of the future, but there isn't, in my view, a sufficient look at the past and undoing the past. That means there's lots of people not thinking about being users of cannabis who are supportive of reform. To me, that's the population saying, we get it, the drug war hasn't worked, prohibitionist policies do more harm than good. And so if you think about what's propelled politically the momentum for these reforms, in so many ways, I think it's a story about concern about prohibition's harms. I think we need to really understand the harms of cannabis prohibition and how they linger. I think we then need to review how existing cannabis reforms are starting to address, but are incompletely addressing, prohibition's harms. And then the final part of the project is envisioning how reforms can better address these harms. I think one of the most important data projects to be done in this space, one of the most important and challenging issues I confront day to day thinking about topics in this space is we don't have very good data at all. It's remarkable how incomplete our data are. We use the arrest data because that seems to be the most tangible and consistent because it comes from the FBI that systematically talks to local police, but data on just how many of the arrests actually translate into convictions, what level those convictions are, and in particular, this is the one that I think an awful lot about, the way in which a marijuana arrest then can catalyze into another kind of conviction, can catalyze into another kind of interaction with police forces, with the criminal justice system. We don't know what that kind of conversion rate is. Another big issue that's come up in some legal cases in states that have done medical and adult use reform is people on the back end of the criminal justice system. They're involved in some other kind of offending, they're released, they're on probation, they're on parole, they're subject to a range of rules. And so it's not necessarily that it's unique that people get in trouble for even legal activities in this space, but we have very poor data on how many revocations of parole and probation and other kinds of criminal justice supervision are prompted by involvement with cannabis. And so there's a lot we don't know, but the data when it comes to marijuana enforcement is so clear and so repeated and so depressing about racial disparity. And it's at every stage, in every way. We don't have really good data on the harms of cannabis prohibition in terms of numbers, other than for sure whatever numbers we get, they're always racially skewed in really distressing ways. Then, of course, and this is what adds to the concern about the echoes of those racial disparities, the consequences, tangible and sometimes intangible, from convictions, from arrests are just profound. There were 641 significant collateral consequences from a nonviolent drug conviction, nearly 500 of which lasted a lifetime. And of course, the most profound and significant and important ones here are related to employment, related to housing, related to government benefits, related to family law issues. I think marijuana enforcement is a huge part of the distrust that gets bred in those communities, and those are things that you can't necessarily put a number on, but that are an important aspect of the harms of cannabis prohibition. And some states, especially some years ago, that did decriminalization didn't see significant declines in arrests. It really didn't have the impact that it was intended to do so. More recent ones, California, a few other decriminalization states, now that we're kind of in a new reform moment, are seeing more impact from decriminalization efforts, and so there's reasons to be hopeful there. I mentioned, though, disparities persisting, right? Even especially in decriminalization arenas, that's where we especially see the risk of pernicious disparities. Hey, we're arresting a lot less people, but they all end up being people of color. One of the great kind of policy debates is, hey, if disparity gets worse, but the overall number of arrests go down dramatically, is that an improvement? Again, it can be on some fronts, obviously less people subject to arrest, conviction, those tangible harms, but you might aggravate the community mistrust story. The problem is, still relatively few programs have been formally adopted. Fewer still have been implemented effectively. The folks who aren't deeply informed on these issues when they're going in their legislatures, when they're going for advocacy, don't even know what's working, let alone what's possible. And so I think one of the projects we'll be working on, one of the things that these kinds of conferences are so great on, is just starting to develop best practices, best understandings to move forward on these issues, but of course advocates need to be at the forefront of pushing it. What's better redress look like? And so here's the sort of three basics for me. A criminal record expungement can't be overemphasized, I feel. I think that just has to be integral to the initial law you pass, right? So that's again where California is at the forefront. In Prop 64 were resentencing and expungement provisions. I think that should be starting point for all advocates if we're doing reform, not, oh, we've got to get it in, we've got to do legalization or some kind of reform, and then the next bill will be focusing on these criminal justice expungement efforts. No, it can be together, it should be together, it needs to be together, and of course it needs to include automatic expungement mechanisms, because I'll mention in a minute just how potentially ineffectual simply making expungement available without putting the resources and the infrastructure in place. Here's where kind of my little added piece is, my little real contribution to a discussion that others are having and having really well. Investment of tax revenues to do social good. I especially think it's critical to be doing infrastructure. And I think what we're missing on a lot of these fronts, whether it's the expungement area, right? So you pass a nice law that says, you know, thousands of people can get their records expunged, and then the data shows 22 people out of 8,000 even try. And that's because they don't know, there's all these barriers to access, and that's something that you're not going to get follow-up on unless you have somebody whose job it is to both document that this new law isn't working the way it was intended and that identifies what's needed. Do we need more resources? Do we need to eliminate certain kinds of functional or legal barriers to access to the courts, or can we do it automatically? What's that infrastructure going to look like? You've got to have those tools in place. Same goes with preferential industry considerations. It's not just a story of getting people in the industry, it's also finding out, do people want to be in the industry? What does being in the industry even mean? Is it working with touch the plant companies? Is it working with ancillary companies? Is it working on these kinds of social justice questions? Part of the idea of building this infrastructure is creating means for people not just to be part of the industry, and then they just become the folks who show up to the industry conferences, right? But they become part of commissions who show up to these conferences and have this experience, lived experience, that can bring to bear these sets of considerations. Again, you know, we can talk more about the challenge that we've had at the local level.